Watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier. Some of you who have watched the show quite a bit might be noticing that we have a fantastic new set here. So shout out to the creative director of Breakthrough News, Will Whiteman, for conceiving and putting this together. But other than that, the fantastic show, The Freedom Side, is exactly the same. And as always, I am joined by my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
It's good to be back with you. I love the new set.
Yes, I hope that everyone in the chat loves it. Certainly, if you do a super chat that is commenting on the set, Rania will definitely read it. Our censor over theirs, but certainly anyone can make any comment you want in the super chat, and if Rania deems it to be appropriate, she will read it. So like I said, other than this fantastic new set, everything is the same here at the Freedom Side. We've got a fantastic show for you here today. We're going to be talking a lot about COP26 and the broader context around it as it considers climate change. We're going to be talking about the struggle around the release or for the release of political prisoners here in the United States, where there's been some renewed activity and some important victories as well. We're going to be talking to trade unionists from the United Kingdom. So we're also going to be talking, of course, about the issues, some of the issues in front of the Supreme Court here in the United States as it concerns a woman's right to choose. So plenty teed up for you here in the show. We want to jump right into it relatively quickly, but just want to remind people, if you are watching on YouTube, to make sure that you hit the subscribe button and hit the bell so you can get all of the great content that's coming here from Breakthrough News. And if you're not watching on YouTube, you can, of course, go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel and hit the bell so you get the alerts. And wherever you may be watching, make sure you hit that share button so that whoever is following you can follow us as we continue the show. So we want to just jump right in here with the climate change. Obviously, it's the topic du jour with COP26 going on in Glasgow, Scotland. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Dipti Bhatnagar, who is the Climate Justice and Energy Coordinator at Friends of the Earth International. Dipti, thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, nice to be on the show.
No, well, we are really happy to have you here. And the first thing I want to ask you, Dipti, is when, we're looking at the news here, especially in the United States, about what we see in COP26, you just see a lot of headlines with a lot of big dollar figures, and it's all like everybody's doing something. They're saving the world. So the first question I have for you is are they saving the world, or is this just a lot of rhetoric and hype?
There's a lot of rhetoric and hype, certainly. So yesterday, there's been a massive announcement on forests. Oh, we're going to have X amount of money for forests. And what that doesn't tell you is that the rich countries really, including the United States, of course, where you are right now, is really pushing fossil fuels, is pushing deforestation, and they've got to cover that up somehow. So then they've invented some schemes which are called net zero, which are called carbon markets. And what they're saying is, don't worry about the emissions. We're going to be able to sequester those emissions in forests. So that's what this big forests announcement has been about. Really, it's absolutely critical to stop deforestation, to stop climate change, but that's not what's happening. If they're going to use carbon markets and offsetting, then that's completely problematic. The other big announcement happened today that there are 20 countries, including the US, Canada, the UK, which are not going to support overseas financing of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. Actually, this is really big. This is a big announcement. But again, there's a catch. So they say that they won't fund fossil fuels abroad, but they're continuing to fund fossil fuels within the country. And of course, we know that there are communities in the US, frontline communities in the UK, who are saying, no, we don't want these fossil fuels in our home either. So there are, there are some interesting announcements happening, but power doesn't want to let go of itself. And there's so much work to be done to change and dismantle power relations, because the climate crisis is not the only crisis that our people are facing. There's inequality, there's a biodiversity crisis, there's so much else going on. And we at Friends of the Earth International, and here at Justiça Ambiental, Friends of the Earth Mozambique, my two organizations, we're fighting for system change, because that is what it's going to take to stop this climate crisis.
I think that's a critically important point, because it really does feel that so much of this has kind of a greenwashing effect to it, that it's like we can solve all the problems without changing anything at all, and in fact sort of falling back on things. And I know, you're there in Mozambique, which I think is in many ways a good example of this. There's a lot of natural gas that has been found there recently, and it's being promoted as this is great, it's going to solve poverty, it's going to change everything for the country of Mozambique. And I was hoping you could talk about that, and just in general the global south, which I think is obviously being so affected by climate change despite not having caused the problem in the first place.
That's a great question, Eugene. And this really goes back to 500 years of colonialism, genocide, slavery. This is what we're talking about, right? This is what has brought us to this point in 2021, that Mozambique is one of the poorest countries on this planet. Most of our people do not have access to electricity. 70% of our people do not have access to electricity. Most of our people are subsistence farmers and fisher folk. And the situation that you have is that this huge gas field has been found off the coast of northern Mozambique in Cabo Delgado province. And what it's doing to the people, it's increased conflict and militarization in that area. Of course, people have been displaced. People's lands have been taken away. The fisher folk who had access to the sea don't have access to the sea anymore. And it's going to devastate the local ecology completely. So gas and fossil fuels are not a solution for our countries in the global south either. But our people deserve a life of dignity. So what that means is that we need to have a renewable energy system that's actually for the people. We need to have a different development pathway, because the fossil fuel development pathway that the developed countries went down that path has created the climate crisis. And guess what? It's created a huge amount of inequality and suffering for people in the global north countries as well. So we want our countries to go down a different development pathway that puts people and planet first, and not profit and pollution.
And speaking of the issue of inequality, I mean, some figures show that what we call climate debt, the climate debt owed by global north countries to the global south could be as large as like $450 trillion. $450 trillion. So I'm curious, is the issue of climate debt even a part of the conversation at an international event like this? And then also speaking to the issue of how the US really tried to take this a very important event and turn it into an opportunity to try to displace blame for all of the pollution of countries like the United States onto countries like Russia and China. So they tried to like weaponize it for the purposes of their Cold War with China. So how is that kind of like overshadowed or sort of pushed away discussion of climate debt, if that was even a part of the discussion to begin with?
Those are wonderful questions, Rania. So on the climate debt issue, yes, there is a climate debt, a climate and ecological debt that is owed from the countries of the global north to the countries of the global south, because of 500 years of colonialism, etc., which has made the situation that the developed countries have developed their economies, their societies based on fossil fuels, taken up more than their fair share of atmospheric space, to the point that now Mozambique cannot be emitting any more carbon dioxide, because it's going to absolutely devastate the planet. Not that we want it, right? We want a different development pathway. But how are we going to get it in one of the poorest countries in the world? It means that that climate debt needs to be repaid from the global north to the global south. That looks like climate finance. That money needs to be flowing so that our countries can have a just and feminist transition. It's not just a just transition, it's a just and feminist transition that needs to happen in our countries, so that people can have access to electricity, people can have access to sufficient food. It's about sufficiency. It's not about abundance and abuse that is happening in so many parts of the world today. We want a world where everyone has enough, and with that, we're taking care of people and the planet.
Dipti, I think one important element of this whole conversation, of course, is the consequences of not acting. And I think, one thing I'm always curious about in some ways is what is the scale of the impacts that we're facing? I mean, I know the base goal here is to try to prevent anything more than a 1.5-degree warming by the end of the century. According to the New York Times, at least, we're on track for 3 degrees. I mean, what are we looking at in terms of the impacts on the planet if serious action, system change, as you say, doesn't take place?
It's going to be pretty devastating, Eugene. The reason we call for climate justice is because we recognize that climate change is so inherently unjust, right? It affects most those that didn't create the crisis. So, and the impacts of the crisis are very real. 2 years ago, in 2019, we had Cyclone Idai hit the coast of central Mozambique, devastating the lives and livelihoods of thousands and thousands of people. So these impacts are actually happening. There are locust swarms in East Africa. Agriculture is failing. There are droughts and floods in cyclical manners. And of course, this isn't the story just of Mozambique. This is about wildfires in Turkey and California. This is about Germany, one of the richest countries on earth, facing devastating fatal floods. So, of course, the planet is showing us that we need to choose a different development pathway and not continue business as usual. But those in power are not letting go of it, which is why we're demanding that rich countries first, the ones that created the crisis, need to stop fossil fuels in their own countries and abroad. They need to stop escape hatches like the net zero and the carbon markets, and they need to provide the climate finance for our countries so that there can be that energy transition in our countries as well. And we will hold our leaders accountable, right? Because accountability is absolutely important and critical. So this is not just about, give money to our government here. No, because we don't trust the way that our government is going to handle it, because this is about a bigger project of saving democracy, of taking back our states, our countries, so that our governments are accountable to us, to the people who elect them, and not to the polluters who are filling their pockets.
You mentioned it a couple of times, and I think it's a really important point about net zero. Could you actually explain that? Because I think a lot of people see that and they just assume that means that we're going to zero. Obviously, it's a bit more complicated, I think.
That's a great question. So net zero is by definition not zero. The net is trying to say that the balance of carbon emissions, what you emit and what you sequester, should come out to zero. But 100 minus 100 is also zero, and 10 minus 10 is also zero. So what we're trying to say is emitting carbon dioxide, burning fossil fuels, industrial agriculture, deforestation, these are the things that need to stop right now, because we cannot afford to keep putting emissions into the air, because the second part of that equation, which is that sequestration, which brings it down to net zero, is not going to happen. So many of our ecosystems, you see what is happening with the Amazon in Brazil. Our ecosystems, because of the way that they're treated and because of the climate impacts, they are losing the ability to hold that carbon. So this is not about, it's not about the net. We have to stop carbon emissions at source, because the other thing that's happening is that where are they going to sequester all this carbon? This is about land grabs in the global south. The communities whose lands and forests are being taken away because some entity like Shell or Chevron needs that land to sequester their carbon to get down to net zero. Sorry, it's not going to happen. We're going to fight it tooth and nail. We're doing it. We have a team. I'm in Mozambique. I did not get to travel to the COP this time because of all the barriers that have been put on because of the organization of this event. But our team is there from Friends of the Earth, challenging those in the halls of power as much as possible.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, it seems like watching the coverage of COP26, a lot of it was about the statements made by oligarchs, like,
Mm.
and various presidents of the most powerful countries in the world. It seems like the dominant conversation being had is by the people doing all the polluting, and they're giving really like fake sort of pretend solutions, which is essentially what you're talking about. And then they're being praised by the media. I mean, we're presented with this really difficult task where you're up against this like massive international corporate media apparatus that's funded by all the people who are buying up the land that you're talking about, uh, and who are behind deforestation, who are behind fossil fuels. So I feel like a lot of people, when they watch this, when they see what's happening, and we've talked about this on this show before, they become very apathetic about the issue of climate change because they feel like it's just, well, they've accepted it's just inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. The world is ending. So, my question for you is, as somebody who's very active on this issue in a very international way, and from the perspective of the people who are really on the front lines of climate change, how do you deal or respond to that sentiment that I think is very much cultivated by the way the media covers this issue, the sentiment of apathy?
That's a beautiful question, Rania. We do not have the space to not work on this issue. It is just so devastating for so many people across the globe. And the thing is that it's not the only crisis in town. That's what is so important about the way that we look at it. This is about multiple interrelated crises that people are facing on their bodies and their communities, in some cases for generations, right? For centuries. So there is no space to not worry about it and to not work on it, because there's this discussion going on about 1.5 degrees global average temperature rise versus 2 degrees global average temperature rise. And for some it may just seem like a number, 1.5 and 2, but we've got to look at it as in that gap between 1.5 and 2 are lives. Basically what we're saying is how many people are going to suffer, how many people are going to lose their lives, their livelihoods, their homes, because we didn't act as a global community. We didn't act, and we just allowed runaway climate change to happen. So we come to it from this, we cannot give into the fear narrative, because fear makes us do terrible things. Really, this is about hope. This is about the beauty of people power, people coming together in Glasgow right now, but all over this continent of Africa and all over the world. And this weekend, there's going to be a global day of action. There's going to be a march in Glasgow. There's going to be actions all over the world. People coming together to say, no, we don't accept this. We don't accept this inaction. We don't accept this malaction. And we don't accept our people being treated like numbers and statistics. We're going to fight for our people because our communities are important, because there's love and beauty in our communities. And that's, we need to talk about a change of value system as well. This isn't just about changing the energy system and the food system. Of course, that needs to happen. Absolutely needs to happen. Economic justice work needs to happen. This is also about changing hearts and minds and changing our value system so that we're talking about cooperation. We're talking about people working together instead of profit and competition, the way that the world is set up right now. So the work that we need to do is just this bigger project about how do we bring everyone along in this fight for climate justice? How can everyone see themselves in a small way represented in this fight? What can people do to feel like they're a part of it? And this isn't about individual actions, because corporations love to say, you need to take a shorter shower because you're the problem. Absolutely not. The corporations are the problem, right? Don't let them tell us that we are the problem individually, but we need to get together. We need to educate ourselves. We need to build those narratives, and then we need to come together as best we can while we're raising our children and having our families. All of that needs to happen. How do we come together and do our bit to change the narrative and to fight for what's we can't afford to lose this fight because we're going to lose too many people. We need to just be there and do our struggle and do it the best that we can, as if our life and our planet depended on it, which it does.
That's 100% true. And I think in addition to the point Rania was making that I think is so true about sort of the enforced attempts to create apathy amongst the population. I think the other thing that's often thrown out there is that, well, it's just not possible. Technologically, there's just nothing we can do. You know, we're behind the eight ball. Let's do as much as we can, but it's just all pie in the sky to say that we can really address climate change in a serious way. How do you respond to that?
Actually, it's the opposite. They're pushing out all these unproven, dangerous technologies, geoengineering. They've got some of these technologies which are literally pie in the sky, or rather umbrella in the sky. We'll put a big, umbrella that's going to reflect the sun back. We're going to put iron filings in the ocean, and that's going to suck up carbon dioxide. They're trying to throw their technofixes at us. Why? Because they do not want to change the power relations. They do not want to stop the emissions at source. And that's what we're fighting for, right? We're fighting for, you need to stop those emissions and not give us those technical, dangerous technofixes that are going to make things worse. Though, they're going to grab lands of people. They are designed to concentrate power so that there's going to be a group of people, some powerful people, who are going to be making decisions on where does it rain and when does it rain. And we say no. We say no to that. We need systemic change to be able to deal with these crises, not these techno fixes.
Extraordinarily important points, all of it, and we really appreciate you joining us here on the show, Dipti, giving us some of your time to help us sort through all these important issues here on the freedom side.
Thank you so much.
No, well, the pleasure was all ours, as always, Rania. And I think that, obviously we've been talking about this 3 weeks in a row because it's so critically important. And it's just, I feel like every day I see some new headline that's like, oh, I saw something yesterday. Corporations pledge $130 trillion to save the planet. And I mean, maybe they did pledge $130 trillion to save the planet. I'm sure they did. They wouldn't have written that if they didn't. But it's just the fact that it's so decontextualized. If I'm a casual consumer of the news, I might say like, oh, they're dealing with it. Great. Let's move on. I remember I was sitting at a restaurant right after the Paris Climate Agreement when I had the Sunday New York Times. And, the whole front page was about Paris Climate Agreement. And the third paragraph of the lead article, and of course it was all like the Paris Climate Accord is great and it's changing the world. The third paragraph, it said, but climate scientists around the world have noted that the pledges at the Paris Climate Accords is not enough to actually save the planet. And I'm like, well, how is that not the headline? How is they didn't actually do what they were supposed to do not the headline? But it does speak to how the issue is covered. Oh, Rania, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
My apologies. I was muted. I am now unmuted. I silenced myself. I can't get mad at anybody but myself here. No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the fact of the matter is I glanced at, some of the coverage this week of COP26, and all of it was like there's even one article that got covered, or one event that got covered by every big outlet. And it was like the CEOs, like 90 CEOs of every multinational corporation in the world came together to pledge that they're going to fight climate change. And I'm like, is this a joke? Like, these are actually the people responsible for it. Their companies are responsible for it. They're not going to fight climate change. And all of these corporate media outlets are just here to do PR for them. It's like the way that if you ask someone what they think of Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, they're like, oh, they're good philanthropists. It's like, no, they're oligarchs who fund media outlets to make you think they're philanthropists.
Indeed.
And the same goes for climate change. I mean, it really does. And so I'm happy that we continually get to bring people on who can push back against the narrative that all of these outlets are trying. There's two narratives they want you to believe in. The first one is that climate change is inevitable. We're all doomed. Just give up. Maybe don't even have kids. And just, whatever, it's over. The world's ending. There's that one. And the other one is that don't worry, like the masters of the planet, the oligarchs of the planet are going to fix it with weird technology that nobody's invented yet. And so in both of those cases, or actually the third narrative is take shorter showers. I'm sorry, I forgot the third one. But all of those things are very wrong. So I'm glad that we have this platform to be able to break through those BS narratives.
Should be here all weekend, folks. We're going to keep moving forward here. We got plenty for you here in the show, so keep sticking with us. Make sure you hit that share button for everyone who's following. If you're on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell and get the alerts. We're going to be talking about very dangerous air pollution here in the United States. We're going to be talking more about the struggle for political prisoners also here in the United States and the Ahmaud Arbery trial, the ridiculous jury. But now we want to keep it in the UK. We want to turn our attention here to, I think, some of the important intersections and between climate and the economy. And for that, we are very happy to welcome with us Steve Hedley, who is the Senior Assistant General Secretary of the Rail, Maritime and Transport Workers Union, the RMT, in the UK. Steve, thanks so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. Recently, the RMT held a protest that you were saying, cut carbon emissions, not jobs. And I thought that was notable to me because obviously public transit is a major part of saving the climate. And the Prime Minister and a lot of other politicians there have been talking very large about how they're going to address the climate. But it seems that perhaps that's a lot more rhetoric than reality, Steve.
Yeah, absolutely. They've used the COVID crisis, the pandemic, to actually cut services on trains and get rid of staff and cut bus services as well. So what we have is the greener forms of public transport, and certainly greener than the motor car. People are being driven off them and into their cars because that's the only way they can get around in a lot of areas. So we have, on the one hand, the government, trying to greenwash its agenda, and on the other hand, in reality, what's happening is people are being driven back towards motor cars and towards polluting the environment. I mean, the air is tremendously bad here in London. Even the mayor has the act now to extend the ultra low emission zone, which we have, right out to a motorway circle in London, because the air pollution is so bad. But at the same time, they're cutting transport services. So we have a mixed message. One message for the public and one message for the actual workers and the travelers.
I think this is such a crucial issue from the point of view of how we conceive what can happen here in climate. And I just wonder, from your point of view, what's behind the logic of what's happening there with cuts to jobs of transportation? I mean, is it an attempt to privatize it? Do they want to promote the auto industry? Is it all those things? I mean, what is the logic they're using in the context of this massive climate crisis to be attacking public transit and the workers that run it?
Well, I mean, we have a very peculiar system in Britain. What we have is private companies, train operating companies, and rolling stock companies, and many bus companies that are actually financed by the government, so they're guaranteed a profit. They're in the process of creating a body called Great British Rail, which again will be run by a sort of overarching body, government-appointed body, a quango, if you like. But private operators will again be given managerial roles within that, so they'll actually be operating the franchises that they may be operating at the minute, or perhaps different franchises. So you have a ridiculous situation that during the pandemic, for example, £9 billion was given to private railway companies, and £1 billion of that was paid directly to their shareholders, although they were saying that they were making a running loss, but the government were financing them £9 billion. They gave them £1 billion to their shareholders. And of course, somebody's got to pay for that. So the somebody is the worker and the commuter. They're the people that are going to pay for it. And they don't want to attack their friends who make huge donations to the Conservative Party here.
It really is a notable fact to me that there is so much of this greenwashing going on as it concerns at least Boris Johnson. I mean, in terms of the rest of the political scene, I mean, obviously this is happening in Glasgow, and I know that's a SNP area. I mean, are there other political forces in the country that are more truthful on this issue of protecting the rights of workers and expanding public transit, or is it a sort of across the board a challenge?
green movement. The green movement's not a politically coherent movement. You've got people gluing themselves to the road, which is all very laudable and raises the issue. But ultimately, it's a case of having to change the system. We need a planned economy. We need a massive redistribution of wealth, not just at a national but on an international basis, to stop climate change. Because you can imagine it, and I don't agree with this, but if you can imagine if you were sitting in China that's going through a kind of industrial revolution, pretty advanced, but a huge country, completely uneven development, or India, and they would be saying, well, look, you've had all this, we're having it now. So there has to be some redistribution of wealth to compensate them for not using those fossil fuels that European countries used in the past to actually have their own industrial revolutions and to get to the stage of capitalism that they've got at the minute. And if people can't see that, really, we're going nowhere. I mean, the fact that China didn't turn up for the COP26, India turned up and said that they would have by 2050, 20 years later, and everybody else, a carbon neutral policy. These are real political issues, and they exist because those countries are developing. Masses of people in those countries are still poor, especially India. And the existing system, the capitalist system, would necessitate them to industrialize and produce commodities in order to combat that. Now, to pretend that somehow, and I like the way one of your guests said, to pretend that putting a few more things in the recycling bin and taking shorter showers is going to actually solve anything is just completely fallacious. And we have the sort of grotesque picture of Boris Johnson appearing on TV, and one of his ministers is saying that we're all climate activists. There was a famous climate activist over here called Swampy who used to tie himself to trees and stuff like that. And you have these Conservative MPs from the Bullingdon Club, and these are people who burn £50 notes in front of homeless people, and that's their initiation, saying that they're all now climate activists like Swampy tying themselves to trees. It's absolute rubbish. It's a completely fallacious, corrupt sort of narrative that they're trying to promote. The only people really who have got, people, maybe I'm biased because I'm one of them, are Marxists who realise that we need systemic change. We need socialist societies, planned economies, planned industrialisation, planned industries where we can actually have a green alternative, a safe transition and a just transition to fuels and methods of creating energy like wind power, like solar power, that are not going to endanger jobs but are going to give decently paid unionised jobs. Socialists are the only people who have got the answer to this crisis.
Steve, I'm so happy to hear you talk about this in socialist terms, because I feel like that's so often what's missing from this climate conversation from the environmental movement. You mentioned that the green movement isn't really ideologically coherent. And I think that's the case in the US too, to a certain degree, because you have a lot of liberal organizations that care about the environment, but they won't touch it from an economic perspective. So how do you like educate people about the importance of the economic aspect to climate change? Because at the end of the day, the real culprit here, we all know, is capitalism, but it's totally missing from the conversation.
Missing from a conversation because the people who control the vast majority of the media are in the pocket of the capitalists, or indeed are the capitalists. So, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, we've got shows like this, they've got the BBC and CNN and all these other programs. Yeah. But I think the reality is that in 10 years' time, if we continue how we're going, and even if we meet the COP26 targets, 30% of London will have regular flooding. Now, these are government statistics. These aren't something some green scientist has made up in the back of a cigarette paper. These are the government statistics. So a third of London will have consistent flooding, which means that the rivers will burst, the sewage systems will open, and a lot of the time people will be kind of walking around in flooded streets. That's what we're looking at in 10 years. So it's often that there may need to be a crisis before people actually start waking up and going, we need to do something about it. Because socialist arguments aren't wrong. It's just that they have to find the right time to be right. They're always right, but people accept them at a time when they become so obvious that they can't be ignored.
Steve, I think that's a really good point, and I'm just curious sort of what you're seeing there in the UK. I mean, I think that we've seen here in the United States, obviously we have a long way to go and many challenges, but many more people starting to awaken to the idea that there needs to be a socialist solution, there needs to be a socialist consciousness. As you probably saw, there was a lot of solidarity with labor unions last month. It was deemed Striketober. I mean, what are you all seeing there in the UK, both in terms of support for the job actions you're taking, but just in general, what's the climate around a movement or the movement to try to push for socialism?
Well, I think that you'll have remembered that Jeremy Corbyn was the leader of the Labour Party. He was absolutely vilified and destroyed and slandered mercilessly by our so-called independent media. By the way, the media, BBC, run by the state, financed by the state over here. I know other people get criticism for that kind of thing, but let's look at our own house. And the absolute fear, the absolute terror that really Jeremy wasn't a communist, he was a kind of left-wing social democrat, put into the ruling class in this country was palpable. You could feel it. You could, and they had to do something to get rid of him. But what he did do, he brought socialist ideas into the mainstream. But his successor in the Labour Party is like a talking mannequin. I don't know if you know him. He's a guy called Keir Starmer. And I really don't know where you got him. He's, if you can imagine it, he's probably less intelligent than Trump in his utterances. And he's, I have no idea why they put him in there, other than it's some sort of desperation to be as close to the Conservative Party as they possibly can. This sort of triangulation strategy that Blair was successful with. The point being, like it or not, Blair had actually a bit of charisma. He was a bad person, bad politician, but he had a bit of charisma. Starmer is not going to achieve that, not going to achieve it. So I think that there's, in this country, we have to look at forming another workers' party. And I'll admit, when Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, I joined the Labour Party. But we have to, perhaps I was looking for a shortcut to what we needed to do. But the reality is we have to build a workers' party in this country that's going to be fighting for working class people. There's no shortcut. The climate crisis may provide part of the impetus for that. I think that the industrial struggle now in this country is about to kick off. I think people have had pay freezes over COVID, and by and large. At the moment, inflation is high in this country, higher than it's been probably in 2 decades, since the 1990s. And I think that the conditions are set for a wave of industrial struggles to come.
What are some of the things that you're looking at? I think that's interesting, to hear about in terms of, what we're expecting in terms of industrial action, of labor action there in the UK. Are there, what unions, what professions are most under the gun?
Well, I think there's going to be a wave of transport action, workers going into action. Our union probably in the new year, 2022. I think that the election of Sharon Graham was a good fill-up for the Unite Union, which is the biggest industrial union in this country. She's very much, not tied to the strings of the Labour Party, or at least that's what she's saying at the minute. So the potential is there for industrial struggle. I think even the health professionals, and we have a national health service in this country which has been deliberately underfunded. It's been deliberately run down, and the reason for that is that they want to make it so bad that people will accept privatisation, because we've got a free health service in this country, which is slowly being part privatised, but is free at the point of contact. So we have the health unions who are probably inching towards strike action, the teachers, the lecturers. There's a whole plethora of people who are not happy with what's been going on. And I think that next year, I think we're going to have a wave of industrial action.
You know, one thing I wanted to just ask you about as well, and certainly I think you already sort of referenced it in terms of the importance of countries, you know, like the United Kingdom, like the United States, really taking responsibility for their own actions. I mean, how important and what role does international workers' solidarity play for you, both in this fight around the climate, but maybe more broadly, the fight for a different system?
Well, look, for the climate, we've had absolutely brilliant precedents. We've had green bans in Australia, the Australian building workers union. In the 70s and 80s used to have green bans. They would refuse to build projects. They would refuse to participate, go on strike in projects if they damage the environment. That's something that we could have in this country. We could have workers in this country demanding a transition to jobs that were healthy with the environment, help the environment instead of the fossil fuel industry. And we need to be doing that now. But I think that the fact that we have competing capitalist blocs, and more or less I would include China in that. I don't think China is any longer a socialist country. It's got some vestiges of socialism left, like a planned economy, but I don't think that it is a socialist country. It's quickly becoming a sort of mixed economy. So I think we're going to have competing imperialist blocs, and the fact that we need to reach out to workers in all those countries, because when imperialist blocs fight over resources, and the resources may well be drinking water in the next 20 years, the workers are the ones who are put to the front of that and told to go and fight for that. And we'll have a demonization of the Chinese people, we'll have a demonization of the Russian people, or the people from the global south, or whoever the enemy at that time of the imperialists is. And we need to start absolutely right now getting organizations, not just that sit and talk and write endless presses for that no one reads, but we need organizations that can genuinely organize worker struggle right across the globe. So when they say that there's going to be a war, or they say we're going to attack workers in one country, we can shut down the pipeline on a worldwide basis. I mean, that would be my aspiration.
Well, I think certainly we're looking to see aspirations like that all around the world, and this is obviously a key crisis, and there are many ripple effects. But we really appreciate you giving us some insight here into what you all are doing there at the RMT and the broader struggle that you are waging against Steve Hedley from the Rail, Maritime, and Transport Workers Union in the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Of course. Well, we've got plenty for you here on the show coming up. Just want to quickly remind folks, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's patreon.com/breakthrough news. If you want to become a patron and help us keep this movement moving on, all of your donations, greatly, greatly appreciated. And if you are in the chat in YouTube, you can also make a donation via the super chat. And if your comment is deemed acceptable by Rania, our censor here, we will be more than happy to read it on air. I don't know what criteria you use, Rania. I don't know if you want to give that out, if that's like proprietary information or what.
It's pretty much just like, if I like the comment, I read it. I almost never not read a comment.
That's true.
Unless
You're
like
very,
it
very
says,
democratic.
unless it says something ridiculous. Unless it's like an emoji, in which case I can't read an emoji, you guys.
Honestly, well, the way the things
word.
get copied and pasted to us, it's like the description of the emojis, but
Yeah.
it's just very funny to see the way whoever, codes that describes some of the emojis. It's created some very confused moments between Rania and I about certain comments that have been made.
Yeah, like it'll be like doggy kissy face with a pout, and I'm like, okay, that's not a comment. That's a description of an emoji. I don't know if people have any idea what we're talking about here, but
Well, they don't, but you
it's
know
really
what? Sometimes
funny
they got
if
to
you
get a
do.
little inside baseball, Ronnie. They got to see what it's like on this side of the camera, as it were. Well,
Indeed.
we're plenty of stuff that is still here for you, really important stories. And we want to turn to another aspect of emissions, if you will. We talk a lot about the just specific link between emissions and climate change, but obviously another piece of this is the connection between emissions from many of these different plants that are majorly polluting on people's health. And ProPublica has done a really amazing new investigation that I think people just go check it out. We're going to talk about it here, about the impact of air pollution on cancer-causing chemicals in our air all around the United States. And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Layla Yunus, who is the co-author or one of the authors of the new ProPublica investigation, also a professor at the City University of New York. Layla, thank you so much for being with us.
Ooh, I think you're muted.
Oh, is that our end?
It happens sometimes. It happens sometimes.
No, don't even worry about it. Don't apologize.
Yeah, Eugene's a lip reader.
I'm not. Is it our end or
Oh,
it's not our end? Okay, it's your end. I think it's your end.
no, she's saying it's our end. It's our end. Well, my end is in Lebanon, so it's your end, Eugene.
Thank you. Okay, well, we're gonna
This
try to
is
figure
fun.
this out. Layla,
Yeah.
just give us one quick second here. Sorry about that. You know, things do happen.
You know,
This is live TV. Some people, they tell you
yeah,
it's
that's
live
what
and it's really
happens.
pre-taped. This is the real deal, Rania.
Yeah, this is actually that we're not lying. We're not pretending here. We're actually doing it live. And I was just thinking about air pollution. I know we're about to talk about the US, but you know what it being in Lebanon right now.
Yeah.
One thing that is really awful that's taken place is with the lack of state electricity. Everyone's dependent on these private generators run by diesel fuel. And this has actually increased the air pollution in Lebanon this year by 300%.
Wow.
Because every building is
course.
running on these diesel fuel generators for like, the majority of the day. And you
Wow.
can imagine how that's going to play out for people who, are going to be breathing in this air for the next 5 to 10 years, how that will play out in 5 to 10 years, just every day. And I actually feel the difference too. Like,
Yeah.
excuse me, when I go outside, and in the city, in Beirut specifically, like you just can't get a breath of fresh air.
It's like you're
It's
smoking.
weird. I don't know how to describe it. It kind of feels like there's just a cigarette for everybody in the air. You can't. I mean, it's certainly not good for health. It's not good for your respiratory system. It's not good for children. It's not good for people who already have, or who are already immunosuppressed. So anyways, air pollution up. Speaking of, there goes my electricity.
That I have to say, that is like
As if to
very
prove a
eerie
point.
that happened right at that moment.
It'll come back on, yeah.
Yeah, but it's also an important point for people to know that this, as funny as I know we're laughing about it, that this is people's lives. I mean, no matter, you just doing whatever you're doing, and next thing you know, your power's off. And, we're lucky, not everyone, obviously in the United States, there are sadly too many people who can't afford basic utilities. But I think for so many of us, it's hard to imagine the level of disruption that comes in, just during the course of everyone's day. I mean, while you're doing your job, all these different pieces. Okay, well, we're going to switch back around. I think we are good. I think we have Layla Yunus of ProPublica back with us here on the show. Layla, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
The pleasure is certainly all ours. I have to say, I found the new study that, or the report that you all put together quite shocking, to be honest with you, because I think the way it's always presented in the US is like we have the cleanest air of any country in the world. I've never known how true that was, but to see this is a lot. So before I get too far into it, for those who maybe haven't seen this story yet, just give us a capsule view of what you all were able to find out regarding air pollution and the effect it's having on many of us.
Yeah, so what we basically did at ProPublica was we mapped 5 years of data from an EPA model. We mapped the spread of cancer-causing industrial air pollution from facilities across the country. And these facilities are called major sources of toxic air pollution. So they include refineries and shipyards and big plastics, petrochemical manufacturing plants. And what we found is that 250,000 Americans are estimated to be exposed to cancer risk from this type of pollution above levels that the EPA considers acceptable, and that around a fifth of the population, around 74 million people, are estimated to be exposed to levels that are worse than the EPA's aspirational goal. And we found that, unsurprisingly, this pollution is segregated. So we found that people of color, on average, are experiencing 40% more toxic air pollution than majority white census tracts, and that the disparity is even worse for predominantly Black census tracts, which are experiencing, we estimate, more than double the pollution as majority white tracts.
One of the things that I found most disturbing about the piece is this sort of enforcement aspect of it. I mean, you were able to use an EPA tool to find the information, but from what I understand, the information is out there, but there isn't really an attempt to address this. In some ways, maybe some undercounting of the problem.
Yeah, that's for a couple of reasons. So some of our sources who used to work for the EPA have told us that the agency has been really hesitant to actually use its own data over the past several decades, has been really hesitant to call out polluting industry, particular companies over the years. And the other part of it is that the Clean Air Act leaves a lot of implementation up to the states. And so states like Louisiana and Texas, states along the Gulf Coast that are super cozy with industry, the places where you find the largest hotspots of this cancer-causing air, are not willing to work with the federal government closely to set up air monitors and to, conduct cancer risk studies and do all the things that you really have to do to identify and ameliorate the situation for people on the ground in these really industrial areas.
One of the things that to the extent I know about this problem, it's a little bit in relationship to Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And I know
Yeah.
one of the issues is always, I don't know if it's an issue for me, but certainly one of the things that's always presented is that it's unclear if there's actually a connection between these emissions that are coming from these plants and these high levels of cancer. What did you all find in regards to that issue in this reporting you did?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Ultimately, it is basically impossible in almost all cases to prove a direct connection between an individual case of cancer and a polluting facility. That said, in places like Cancer Alley, you do find pretty high rates of cancer among residents. You do find blocks in communities and neighborhoods where people can say, every single person on this block or many of the houses on this block have experienced cancer cases, right? So ultimately, our map and our analysis is based off of modeled data, right? It is not air samples. It is really just a best guess estimate of real world scenarios. The EPA calls it this model that we use a starting point to identify areas of concern, and we don't pretend that it's anything but that. That said, we have identified many areas of concern in this analysis, and the fact that the agency's had the data for so long and really hasn't sort of had a concerted effort to address these areas of concern, something that they have sort of acknowledged openly to us, is sort of the thing that we're really trying to point out with this investigation. And we also spent time in these communities. I'm actually from Louisiana. During this reporting, I spent some time in Mossville, for example, a community that's been almost disappeared by the South African chemical giant Sasol. There have been studies linking the very health effects that community is facing with the exact chemicals that the industry in the area is emitting. So it's really hard to prove a direct connection. However, the evidence sort of piles up after a while, and it's hard to ignore.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I also thought was interesting was the issue of sort of overlapping effects of multiple plants. And if I understood it right, one of the things that you all were pointing out in your reporting is the EPA will go to like one plant and say, this is what you're doing, this is the risk level, but you might live in a neighborhood that it's like, 8 or whatever. I mean, if you live in Houston, whoever knows how many around you, but that kind of cumulative effect is not taken into account. Is that correct?
Yeah, so basically the way that the EPA does it is they look at individual types of facilities and types of equipment in isolation when they conduct a cancer risk assessment. So for example, if you live in Pascagoula, Mississippi, there's a shipbuilding yard and there's a big refinery, and they're both emitting a lot of really toxic chemicals. But if the EPA is assessing the cancer risk in the area, they're only going to look at the refinery or only the shipyard. It's possible if the refinery has multiple types of equipment in it, which they often do, it'll only look at those particular equipment categories. So they're really sort of breaking down the risk as much as possible. And in the way that they're assessing cumulative impacts and only looking at a really small slice of the air pollution pie in a lot of cases. And so they are regulating without a full picture of what the real estimated risk is. And that's sort of what our map is really trying to show the public is this is what it looks like if you look at everything.
One of the oh, sorry, go ahead, Rania.
No, I was just going to ask if there's any pushback against this in terms of like the people who are living in these areas. Since you spent time there, are they aware that they're being exposed to this cancer causing air pollution at very high rates? And is there any like organizing or pushback? Any organizing or pushback to do something about it?
Yeah, it's a great question. So some of the hotspots that we spent time reporting in are very well known. You named Cancer Alley, that's certainly one of them. Port Arthur, Texas, parts of the Houston metro area. Very well known places with rich histories of organizing, rich histories of community organizing. The local experts on the ground know they can name the chemicals in the air, what they can do to your body. They understand how ethylene crackers work in some cases. I mean, I've been really impressed to hear the level of detailed knowledge that these locals have of the industry. That said, there are certainly other localities where people were surprised to find themselves on our map and were surprised to learn that they are a hotspot or potentially a hotspot of toxic air pollution. The reason for that is that some of these toxic chemicals, like benzene, they smells like gasoline when someone's emitting a lot of benzene near you. Other chemicals like ethylene oxide are colorless and really odorless unless there's a massive quantity of it. So it's really hard to actually tell that you're being exposed in a lot of cases. And so that's why certain hotspots are really unknown to the residents who've been breathing the air even for decades.
Wow. Yeah, I don't know. There's so much that can be said about this. One of the things that I want to ask you about that I think is also really important of this, and you mentioned this at the outset, the racial disparities, the class disparities that are behind this, and the fact that that's not an accident. Talk about that if you could.
Certainly not an accident. This country has an extremely long history of redlining and racist zoning policies. Robert Bullard, the founder of the environmental justice movement, as he's often credited, has talked about the way that parts of Houston have been cited for noxious dumping. So, what we're really looking at here when we look at the results of our analysis and show you that Black communities are exposed to more than double the pollution as white ones, it's something that is rooted in a really, really long legacy that goes back to the foundation of this country, really. And so, the new presidential administration has indicated that they want to take environmental justice seriously, that they want to combat sort of the way that environmental justice communities or communities that are overburdened by air pollution are continually subjected to even more air pollution. But it sort of remains to be seen what's actually going to happen with that and what's going to happen with this new environmental justice board that they've put together. So ultimately, these communities are the sites of legacies of disinvestment, and the unfortunate reality is that when new plants move in, property values decrease and further fuel that cycle of disinvestment. So it's really hard to sort of undo what's been done in certain places like Mossville, Louisiana. Like I said, that community has been mostly destroyed. The majority of its residents have taken buyouts from from the chemical company Sasol. And a lot of them will tell you that, or people that I spoke with told me that they didn't want to leave, and they certainly felt like they weren't given necessarily the fair price for their homes. But how else were they going to, relocate from an area that was making them sick, making their family members sick? So certainly a long legacy, an institutional legacy that is kind of resulting in the numbers and the figures that you're seeing on our map.
Y'all told some really important stories in the piece, and I was just wondering, obviously, I'm sure all of it stood out to you, but is there anything when you just think back on people you met, people you interviewed and talked to, that really stands out to you?
Yeah, I think a lot about Deborah Sullivan. I keep talking about Mossville because it's from my home state, and
Mhm.
I spent some time there. And Miss Deborah, she grew up in Mossville, Louisiana, and she just tells you this really kind of rich story of her life there, growing up in the leafy orchards, and her family, they were hunters and fishers, and they lived off the land. And she tells you sort of growing up and not really knowing that anything was wrong, but that now in retrospect she realizes that there were certain signs like fluorescent pools and the occasional explosion in the sky, and she kind of describes slowly coming to realize what was happening in her community, ultimately leaving to protect her children from that pollution. But the fact that for many of the people that she grew up with, it was already too late for them. Her sister died, I believe, at a fairly young age, I believe either 58 or 60, from ovarian cancer. Had an aunt who died from ovarian cancer. Her sister's husband died from lung cancer, and their son, Stacy, who I also met while I was down there, and is the subject of a documentary called When Great Trees Fall. So Stacy has stage 4 kidney failure, a problem that he was afflicted with since birth, when he was born with 2 small intestines. So, you know, I'm just listing obviously the health effects here, but
Jesus.
what you don't see too is that what Mossville really has is a very strong sort of history. It's a community that was founded by formerly enslaved people long before the Civil War in the 1790s, and so I think what's really lost here is that community and sort of that rich history of those people and the bonds that they had together. So I really do think a lot about them when I tell the story of what we've been finding.
Mhm, mhm. Well, we really appreciate you coming on, Layla. Poison in the Air is the name of the report, ProPublica.org. I really, really couldn't encourage everyone to read it. A very important story, and it could be affecting you in a very serious way, so check it out. Layla, thanks so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. Well, Rania,
It's heavy
just to
stuff.
repeat
That's
some of
heavy
that,
stuff.
74 million people are living over at the level over what the EPA says is where they basically think it's problematic. And then they have 250,000 people over the level of like where it is absolutely problematic. They are, flashing red lights here, and 43,000 who are triple that level. And they tell some just amazing, and I mean that in amazingly shocking stories of people's personal lives, how they've been affected and all of that. So Poison in the Air from ProPublica, I really can't recommend it more highly in terms of a story, for a lot of reasons, but nevertheless, very important stuff. So we want to turn here to another very important issue, and that is the right to choose. And we are very happy to be joined here by Jessica Mason-Piclo, who is a senior vice president and executive editor at Rewire. Jessica, thank you so much for being back with us.
Pleasure.
Oh no. Oh, there we go.
Oh, we thought you were muted, but we got you at the end. You're
Yeah,
not
we thought
muted. You're live.
Well, thank you, Ali said. Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
No, the pleasure is all ours. The last time we had you here, we were talking mainly about Texas. Still certainly an important issue. I know the Supreme Court now is addressing cases regarding Mississippi and Texas. So maybe just to help folks understand who maybe are just seeing things in the news, what exactly is the Supreme Court taking up regarding those two states, and what are the implications?
Sure. So this Monday, the Supreme Court actually heard arguments on the Texas abortion ban that we talked about last time I was here. And for your audience members who might not be familiar about it, that is a ban that is really unique. It's the most extreme anti-abortion law in effect in the country right now. And it does two things. It attempts to ban abortion as soon as there's cardiac fetal activity detected, so a quote unquote fetal heartbeat. And that can happen as soon as 6 weeks in pregnancy. But what's really dangerous and unique, and what the Supreme Court was hearing arguments about this bill on Monday, is a private enforcement mechanism. And this is a portion of the law that outsources to private individuals who don't even have to live in Texas, by the way. They could live in Arkansas, they could live in Oklahoma, they could live here in Colorado if they wanted to. What they do is file lawsuits if they believe somebody is violating this ban. And not just if they're performing an abortion at 6 weeks or beyond, but if they are aiding or abetting somebody getting an abortion. So that's abortion funds, driving somebody to their appointment. This law has been in effect since September 1st, and it's creating a humanitarian crisis in Texas. There's just no other way to say it.
I mean, wow. I know but every time you hear it, you just think like, how is this real life? Go ahead, Rania.
I'm curious, you mentioned it's creating a humanitarian crisis. Can you actually elaborate on that a little bit? Because I don't think people realize, like, they think it's just Texas, like I'm not there. So one, what does that mean? And two, why should people who aren't in Texas be concerned about it?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity, because this is so important. And one of the things in Monday's arguments at the Supreme Court that was very frustrating is the human impact of SB 8, this law, was barely talked about at all. So what this law has done is effectively banned abortion in the state of Texas. It has made it impossible to get an abortion beyond 6 weeks of pregnancy. So that's extremely early on. If you are so lucky to find out you're pregnant early enough to be able to schedule the time off and get an appointment, then you can access care. So what folks are saying on the ground in Texas is that as much as 90 to 95% of abortion care has ground to a halt there. Abortion funds are saying that 75% of the people who they are helping fund procedures are traveling out of state. In my state of Colorado, where I live, our clinics have seen an uptick of over 500% in terms of patient care and needs. So people are traveling far. And this isn't just abortion care that it's impacting. You know, the Washington Post had a story that they ran about a patient who had an ectopic pregnancy and had to drive to New Mexico because the hospital was uncertain if it could proceed. It's not, and this is a procedure that's not covered under SB 8. But the fear of the law, the fear of a lawsuit and $10,000 of mounting liability has frozen reproductive care. So that's just a slice. That is just a segment of what folks are looking at. We know that patients are traveling as far as Alabama, to go get care. So it is really dire. And then you have places like Oklahoma that have a series of laws that were set to take effect on November 1st, but are currently blocked by a court. If those were to happen, right, if those laws and restrictions were to take effect, that further pressures the pipeline. So this is really, I don't use humanitarian crisis lightly. Folks need to understand that people are unable to get basic reproductive health care, and that the places where care is supposed to be protected are beyond capacity.
That's just wild. An ectopic pregnancy, and then that's like a pretty urgent issue. They were sent basically away.
14 hours, 14 hours. And these are time sensitive issues, and then Eugene, you asked me about the Mississippi case. We, in less than a month on December 1st, the Supreme Court is going to consider a direct challenge to Roe versus Wade. So while it's considering this Texas law, while this Texas law remains on the books, it's also going to hear a case where the lawyers will argue that now is the time to recriminalize abortion.
I mean, one of the things, I almost hesitate to even bring this up, but people have been telling me about it, that Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett are good now, I guess, and are going to save us on both of these issues. I didn't believe it, but you are the expert. Should we be expecting them to put on their capes and save the day here?
Yeah, I'm so glad you gave me the opportunity to address this. In Monday's argument, both Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett sounded extremely skeptical of this enforcement mechanism that I was just describing in the Texas law, the one that allows just anybody, sort of any random person to go file a lawsuit. That they were skeptical of that. So they could very well block that. Do I think that then they would turn around in the Mississippi case and also block the Mississippi law, or that they wouldn't, if given an opportunity, actually overturn Roe versus Wade? No, I don't. What the Supreme Court was considering on Monday was a procedural issue, a very important one, but it also gives them an opportunity for some cover. We don't. It's sort of gauche to talk about the court as a political institution, but it is. And we know that the justices pay attention to this stuff. So if they are looking to sort of dial down the temperature when there are conversations around things like court expansion, for example, casting a vote to look moderate in Texas and then have folks kind of forget about it by the time Mississippi happens is certainly one pathway that they could take.
I mean, it feels that a lot of the strategies here from these states is just, we're going to just come up with whatever we can come up with and send as many things into the courts as possible. And, just basically hope that eventually they hit the right formula to eliminate Roe v. Wade. It feels strategic in that sense.
It's absolutely strategic. I mean, the Mississippi case that the court will hear in just a couple of weeks is an excellent example of this. The law that's at issue is a piece of model legislation, and the think tank that effectively came up with it had a meeting and said, where should we shop this to first? And among the states on the table were Arkansas and Mississippi. Where did they go? They went to Mississippi. They approached a couple other states too, and other states passed those copycat laws. But they went to Mississippi first. And one of the reasons why they went to Mississippi first is because it was heavily gerrymandered. They knew the lawmakers wouldn't ask any funny questions about what's actually in the bill. They knew there was a friendly attorney general who would vigorously defend it when it was challenged. There's only one clinic in the state. So it really has the ability to absolutely create a vice grip on a state where access is already limited. So it was really, truly a perfect storm of political opportunity for them. And they took it and they went all the way to the Supreme Court with it. And they said they were going to do that. Kay Ivey was having press conferences that says, we know this law is unconstitutional. We hope it goes to the Supreme Court because we want this to be the vehicle that overturns Roe versus Wade.
Wow. I mean, it really is, the level of cynicism behind it, I mean, says so much here. And I'm glad you brought up this issue of the court being a political institution, because it feels like that's the other sort of shoe that's dropping here is, if you say court packing, then people say, oh, you're going against the traditions of America and all these other pieces. But it does seem like those who want to just eliminate abortion in this country, and of course, many other things that they want to do that are terrible, they're willing to use the courts as being highly political. So, I mean, I wonder just how you feel about that question, because I know it's one of these, sort of hot button issues when it comes to the courts. Well, not amongst the right, but amongst, sadly, many progressives.
Yeah, I mean, it blows my mind that it truly is, because one, we have apolitical evidence for expanding the Supreme Court at a minimum. We used to have as many Supreme Court justices as we had at federal appellate circuits. We have 13 appellate circuits now. We should have 13 Supreme Court justices. That's not like a political thing at all, right? But the idea that this is somehow, again, playing politics in a dirty fashion, and that's what Democrats and progressives don't do, is just, I mean, it's ludicrous. We'll lose every battle if that's the case. Mitch McConnell very successfully captured the federal courts for a lifetime. And that wasn't just under the Trump administration. This was a mission of his for 20 years. Anytime they had an opportunity to stymie Democratic appointees, they did. Anytime they had an opportunity to jam through Republican nominees, they did. And Democrats were like, geez, we're just trying to play nice here. And I mean, as a result now, Trump was able to appoint 1 in 4 federal circuit appellee judges. So 1 in 4 judges on the federal courts of appeals is a Trump appointee. Those folks have
Jesus.
said that they don't know if Brown versus Board of Education was rightly decided. They are opposed to Roe versus Wade. I mean, so what do progressives and Democrats hope to accomplish in a policy agenda with these folks deciding the outcome?
You know, when we look at the issue of, you know, the courts and how we move forward, where does this leave the issue of legislation? I mean, I know a lot of people have been saying for many years that Roe v. Wade should be codified in law, but it does seem like the more of these negative decisions we at least potentially get, that could constrain what a law could do. I mean, how do those two things work together? How should they?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Absolutely, we need some sort of federal codification of abortion rights, whether it's the Women's Health Protection Act or something that goes beyond that. I mean, it is a no-brainer at this point. We've seen states that are so heavily gerrymandered just use this for political opportunity. So without a doubt, and we know that in terms of constitutional law, this is how their give and take works. If the Supreme Court rolls things back, Congress can answer. Congress absolutely can answer. Now, will Congress answer? That's a different question. That's a question of political will and, you know, the apparatus standing in the way. Can we get a codification of Roe so long as the filibuster exists? I don't believe so. You know, I mean, I think that that's a very real conversation that Democrats and progressives have to be prepared to have.
You know, it's interesting because it feels like this issue of abortion and, you know, pro-life, pro-choice, like 10 years ago played a bigger role in the culture war nationally than it does now. Like I don't see Republicans on the national level really running on the issue of abortion. Not like they used to, where it was like center stage. And I know that, you know, the way the public feels about stuff doesn't necessarily reflect how it's going to play out politically or in Congress. But is that at least a positive sign? The fact that as far as the culture war goes, the public is like on a different page on a national scale than Republicans are?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it also shows and speaks to the real danger and failure within the pro-choice movement from relying on the courts over the 20 years. You know, public opinion is absolutely on the side of keeping abortion legal. Folks know the dangers of what happens when people cannot access reproductive health care that they need. And so with Roe legal now for almost 50 years, folks pretty much know somebody, whether they realize it or not, who's had an abortion. There are folks whose lives are benefited every day by this. And I think the abortion storyteller movement has really done a lot of good here in moving that needle. Not necessarily, I can't say if they've changed public opinion, but they've changed the public conversation so that even you're hearing things like safe, legal, and rare. That's no longer even in the conversation now. People understand that that is a stigmatizing way to talk about abortion, that abortion is healthcare. And when people need healthcare, they need to be able to access it when they need it.
And I guess like where are we headed now with this legal battle? What comes next?
That's a great question. So, I mean, we wait to see what the court is going to do in Texas. And with this case, they could rule very quickly. We could get a decision as early as this week still. You know, we could get something very soon given the procedural posture of how the case got to the court. And then I mentioned the Mississippi case. By the end of the summer, we could know if abortion remains legal in this country or not. There are over 26 states that would instantly criminalize abortion should Roe versus Wade be overturned. So the landscape could look very different in July than it does now. And I will say that it probably will. I don't know that the court will go that far in Dobbs. I think what happens next is that we will get a series of decisions that allows more and more extreme abortion bans to stay on the books. I do think ultimately we will get a decision that overturns Roe versus Wade, in part because the anti-choice movement won't be satisfied until they do, no matter what they say on a national stage. Like that's really, truly what they're going for. And they have the votes on the Supreme Court to get it.
Wow. I mean, it really is a dire circumstance on so many fronts. And I mean, it just feels that on so many levels, they've already done so much damage, Jessica. I mean, you know, there's only one place in Mississippi, as you mentioned. Texas,
Mhm.
everybody's in a holding pattern. I'm assuming probably it's not that much better in Alabama and some of these other states. I mean, it feels that even without getting a total ban, I mean, they really have done quite a bit of damage on this front.
They absolutely have. And I think it's important to, make connections to the fact that they're not doing anything to advance maternal health outcomes on the other side, too. This is not a war on, rights. It's a war on bodies. It's a war on people, ultimately. And we talk about it in a rights context, but these are actual human people that are involved, These are their lives. And so we need to be holding the anti-choice movement accountable on that end.
Well, as always, Jessica, really appreciate you coming on, helping us sort through all of this. And as always, it's our pleasure to have you here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you so much for having me back.
No, of course. We'll have you back again to help us keep sorting through this because unfortunately, obviously we can see that there's a lot happening.
It's not going away.
Pike. I also have to say, Rania, too, real quick, greatest Twitter handle on Twitter, Jessica Mason-Piccolo, Hegemony. Amazing. I don't know, who do you pay to get that?
I was looking at that.
So good.
That's pretty good.
That's
good. Pretty good. I like it.
So do I. Seriously, it's so good. I mean, the only one that's close, the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin is a guy named Mandela Barnes, and he has the other Mandela, which is also quite good.
Oh my God. But that's like only one person can have that. Like not anybody could come up with that. Yeah.
Hegemony, I feel like has just a nice intellectual
I'm going to
touch
call
to
myself. Yeah, I'm going to call myself the other Mandela. It wouldn't make any sense. I was a really bad joke. Can we just pretend I didn't say that?
Yeah, you're at Rania Kalik. Is that you?
Yeah, it's very original.
Yeah. Well, people can find
there
you.
There isn't another one. That's true.
We got a super chat here. Mi Ling Wei.
Oh.
Shout out to you. Thank you so much for your
no
donation.
comment. I want to remind people that if you have something to say and you want me or Eugene to read it on air, you throw money in the super chat.
Gotta pay for it.
And we'll likely do that. Yeah, you gotta pay for us to read you on air. It's also a good time to remind people that it's if you do want to support our show, you can also go to our website to give a one-time donation. We have a link for that. Or even better, you can become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news and help support all our incredible content, including this live stream, including Eugene's show, The Punch Out, my show, Dispatches. And now we have the video form of the Socialist Program, one of the best podcasts out there, hosted by the one and only Brian Becker. So just throwing that out there for people. Now, Eugene, some interesting things have happened this week.
Many things have happened this week that are stunning. The one that someone pointed out to me, actually Brian Becker, the Socialist Program earlier this morning, that I have to say is, I don't even know what to say about this, but there's the trial of Ahmaud Arbery is ongoing more or less. Trying to make sure I get this right here. But the jury selection has been happening. And for those who may have forgotten, just really quickly, Ahmaud Arbery was the gentleman who was murdered by, I guess it was 3 vigilantes ultimately. I think there's 3 people involved, but it was 2 people who were the most directly involved.
Family.
Yeah, 2 of them were family, and the third, I think, was just like their buddy. He was out jogging. In the course of jogging, he took a look at a home that was being built, as many of us do as we move around and see what's going on in neighborhoods we frequently are in. He frequently ran in this route. These racists determined that he was some sort of, dangerous intruder. They followed him in a truck. They pulled a shotgun on him. He defended himself. And by defending himself, I mean he just tried to not be shot by them. And then they shot him in the course of the act. So it was essentially a lynching, more or less. I mean, 3 random guys, white guys, of course, ran him down in a truck, essentially, based on their own totally subjective decision that he was some sort of whatever. I don't even know what they were thinking. I mean, even if he was doing exactly what they said, what were they doing? Even if he did break into the house to steal something, why are you running him down in a truck with a shotgun? Everyone thinks they're, Wyatt Earp out here or something in some of these racist suburbs. But
so outrageous.
Nevertheless, these individuals are on trial. And the jury selection is happening. And so there's 1 black juror on the jury. So there's 12 people on the jury, 11 are white, 1 are black. But here's the just unbelievable nature of so many of this. One, our producer Nicole produced some stats for me here, and I'm looking at them for the first time. One black juror, the county is 76% black. Wow.
You're
the judge
kidding.
said the jury pool was 25% black, and of course, there's only one out of the 12 jurors who is black. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up here that is deeply notable, Rania, that I want to get right here. So, anyone who's ever been on a jury, they ask you all these different questions. Prosecutors' defense have a certain amount of just preemptory challenges, and then they can challenge you, for a particular cause. So there were all sorts of all sorts of questions that were out there. You have one that was, I think, around the Confederate flag, where they were asking people if they thought the Confederate flag was a racist symbol. And if you said yes, you were dismissed.
Oh my God.
Because you were biased.
What?
If you had been to a Black Lives Matter protest in the past year. Now, remember, 20 million people protested last year. Obviously, this is an uprising against racism. It's a 76% black county. If you've been to a protest, you were disqualified. So on all levels, if you had any feeling that racism is real, basically, you weren't allowed to be on the jury.
But isn't it safe to say that the Confederate flag is racist and that 20?
Those are just objective facts.
I mean, it is safe.
Wasn't 25% of people went out to protest last year? Yeah,
I mean, huge numbers of people.
I can't believe what you just said. All of that,
Now you got me with the population. With the population, that's insane.
Yeah, 76% black.
Wow. I don't even have a comment. That's fucking out. Sorry, I didn't mean to curse like that. I just that's outrageous.
Yeah.
No, you can curse now, Rania, because Eugene has a black background, so we're
it's a late night
after dark.
Wait, what? Yeah, I can't believe what you just said. That's like what you read in an article about a trial that took place 100 years ago. That there's one black guy on the jury, and
it says a lot where
the flag is racist. Wow.
I mean,
that is.
Yeah, go ahead.
Unbelievable. No, I don't have anything else to say. I'm actually speechless. You know how hard it is to make me speechless. All I do is talk.
I mean, I have to say, I was I guess I'm not that surprised that there's only one black juror on the jury. I mean, you obviously racial exclusion on juries is a major, major issue. I mean, one thing I will say is this could end up being grounds for an appeal for sure. Technically, it is illegal to exclude jurors on the basis of their race, something called the Batson decision. Now, how do you prove that someone's being excluded on their race rather than some other issue? Is always a big question. I would say going to a Black Lives Matter protest and making that one is up there. But nevertheless, it just shows the power to me of judges. And we've talked about this before, Rania, and as it concerns a range of different cases. The power of judges to just put their thumb on the scale aggressively as it concerns the outcome of a trial. And we talked about the Kyle Rittenhouse thing last week, sorry.
Yeah, it was last week.
How he's being treated with just absolutely kid gloves. They're saying that people he killed can't be called victims, even though he had an assault rifle, and one of the people he got killed, the best he had was a skateboard, but you can't call them victims. And he's, getting every possible accommodation. And then also these random vigilantes are getting every possible accommodation in the Ahmaud Arbery trial. I mean, it really is just unbelievable that the judge is it's unbelievable that the judge is doing this and is allowing this and making this go forward. But it says everything that needs to be said about the criminal justice system in the U.S.
He acknowledged it, though. He acknowledged that. He said that it appears that there to be intentional discrimination in the juror selection. The judge acknowledged it, and it's still going on with the trial.
Wow. Okay, I was wrong there. It's only 27% black in the county, not 76. But the jury pool was 25% black. Either way, it's one out of 11 people in a trial that's about racism. But I guess that's why you don't want any black people there.
Well, can I mention another piece of incredibly outrageous news that's on this level, just involving a different country, is I'm sure you guys saw that a Pentagon review has concluded, and this is really surprising. I really thought there was going to be people held accountable. I don't mean what I just said. A Pentagon review has concluded that the U.S. drone strike that killed innocent civilians in Kabul, including children, in the final days of the Afghanistan war, was not caused by misconduct or negligence, and therefore the Pentagon does not recommend disciplinary action. So the people who make the rules have decided that killing 10 civilians, including children, isn't breaking their rules. And I'll add something to that I thought Kevin Gosztola, who we've had on the show before, incredible national security reporter, pointed out on Twitter, is that as the people that did this with a drone strike killed 10 civilians in Afghanistan, which is our way of saying goodbye to Afghanistan as our country withdrew, the people that did that, no one will be held accountable. Meanwhile, Daniel Hale, the drone whistleblower, is sitting in a maximum security prison in horrendous conditions for telling the public about violations of international law and war crimes. And so, you know, there's another piece of, I mean, it just kind of goes, it's like when we talk about the US, it's really like the way the US behaves externally is also in many ways the way the US behaves internally. And then, you know, one extra thing I want to add to that before I get your all's reactions, and this is also related to Afghanistan, is meanwhile, heroin is disappearing in the US just 1 month after the US withdrew from Afghanistan. And what I find interesting about this is, you know, we've talked about this on the show before. It's like wherever the US military or its weapons or its support for police forces goes, drugs follow. Yeah. And it's interesting to me that the US leaving Afghanistan has had a negative impact on the heroin trade there. And that just says a lot about what America's wars and interventions are actually about.
Yeah, well, especially because the U.S. spent all the time saying the Taliban were just a bunch of drug dealers. When in fact, it was their own allies that were dealing the most drugs, no doubt about that. But yeah, no, I mean, it's just the fact that what you quoted there, Rania, that they found that it was not negligence or misconduct. I mean, they told the world that this was a strike against ISIS to stop a suicide bombing, and it ended up being, I don't know if they were all members of the same family, but some of them were members of the same family. There were children who were, how is that not negligence? I mean, it's certainly, you know, misconduct, but I mean, really? I mean, you thought they were terrorists and they were children and you killed them and that's not negligence? I mean, it really just shows that the bar is it's set so high that it can never be crossed, right? I mean, they just set the bar so high that there's no way they'll ever be held accountable for anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also a matter of like, I tend to be a super big pessimist. I know people like to invoke international law and say, well, this is a violation of it, this is a violation of it. But in reality, international law is a tool of the powerful. While I do think it has importance, it's also made by countries like America, and it's made only to apply to those America sees as an enemy, to those who challenge American hegemony. It never applies to Israel. It never applies. And if it does ever apply to America and Israel, it's always done in this balanced way where all sides committed crimes. That's what you'll see from like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International when they officially accuse Israel of like, oh, you violated the laws of war.
There's bad people on both sides, Rania.
Yeah. Yeah. When it's like, just like this is a one-sided conflict where one side is bad and one side is being oppressed. But there's a similar thing that you'll see with the US, like, and so even and these countries are never held accountable. I mean, when we talk about who's been charged in the international court, it really is just like the international court to charge non-white leaders. Like that's it.
I mean, I think like, it's only Africans, or I think they got some non-African recently.
They got like Milosevic in there, but he's not, is he really white? Like, are you, I mean,
no, they
really
didn't get Milosevic in the ICC. That was The Hague.
Did they not?
Yeah, that was The Hague. It's a different one.
So it really is only black leaders.
Yeah,
but you know, what that says to me is that if you think that's a fair situation, then you think only black people commit war crimes. Like,
Yeah.
there's no other way to view that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it really is unbelievable. I mean, everything we know, of course, about how the U.S. has tried to pressure the International Criminal Court. But I mean, the drone program has been lawless since pretty much day one. I mean, it's been forgotten now, unfortunately. But, you know, it was the Obama administration that like really came out with the first official framework for, you know, drone attacks or whatever. They had the white paper that came out. Obama did a whole speech about it. And there are a number of things in that white paper that I thought were deeply notable. But the one that really stood out the most to me both then and now was, in order to justify the ability to just randomly drone strike anyone, anywhere, at any time, they used the same rationale as Richard Nixon did to invade Cambodia when he secretly invaded Cambodia in 1969 rather. And it really is just an unbelievable precedent to use. I mean, it's still stunning to me today, but it just gives you a sense of like where they're at, is that they are,
You know,
just pulling from every wild thing in order to do it.
well,
ahead.
you reminded me that you said that. Yeah, they invoked like an argument Richard Nixon used for Cambodia, and then they also invoked Israeli president, like
Yeah.
the Israeli Supreme Court president, for killing the leaders of Palestinian resistance groups with drones. So you're right, like pulling out wild cards to justify their
Their drone war.
right,
I mean,
as they
the
thought
other
it
thing
was,
about it was,
to execute people without a trial.
and the other thing about it that I thought was wild is they said, so, you know, you're in X country, I'm in Y country. The U.S. comes and says, well, I guess not X country and Y country, the U.S. and some other country. They come to you and they say, Rania, listen, you've got a terrorist within your borders and we need to take him out. We got to drone strike him. And you say, well, hold on. That's not a terrorist. That's, you know, a great guy. We love this guy. We're not going to
That's a group of children.
That if a country says you cannot enter our airspace and just randomly kill someone, and they don't have to give you any evidence at all. They just have to say, hey, we're going to come kill you first, or you're going to kill this person first. And you say no, that they can just do it anyway. And I just thought, well, that's unbelievable. I mean, so you're basically saying that no matter what happens, only the United States has the ability to determine who is a quote-unquote criminal, quote-unquote terrorist, and just murder them regardless of what the other country says, as long as you give them a heads up. But then it also said you didn't have to give them a heads up. So, I mean, it's just the level of lawlessness there is just outrageous.
So American. It's so American.
It is.
That's the rule of law.
Right.
Yeah. That's the international rules-based order.
Jeez. That's the worst term.
The worst term.
Yeah, Juan, go ahead.
I do want to backtrack a little bit because something that you said kind of stuck with me. Just talking about the trials. You said like, who are these people? Like, and why is it their job to do this? It's like so much the same situation with Kyle Rittenhouse. Like it, like his reasoning behind it was like there was a gas station that was going to be set on fire, which is why he shot people. But like, is that his gas station?
Right.
What gave him domain to protect his gas station? Like, why do people feel so obligated? Like, it reminds me of all these like videos of people like bothering people when they're having a cookout or trying to sell water, right? Because they have so much, they believe that they have the right to interfere, and people like just living their lives or doing something that they don't believe in. So much so that they're willing to use force, willing to kill people, willing to hunt people down. And I don't know if it's out of boredom, out of privilege, out of hatred, or out of all of them at the same time.
Those things. It's probably a mix of those things.
I got
like,
so upset my box moved.
Well, I mean, it's an upsetting issue. It's an upsetting issue. I mean, it really is. I mean, I think you're hitting on such an important point, Juan. I mean, you know, you think about Elijah McClain, you think about Tamir Rice. In both those cases, people called 911 and admitted on the 911 call there was no issue. I mean, in Elijah McClain's case, the person who called was like, yeah, it doesn't seem like there's anything wrong. It doesn't seem like anyone's in danger. Why did you call 911?
But there's a black guy.
Because
there was a black
Rice, they were like, we think it's a toy gun. Then why would you call 911 and say there was a kid with an assault rifle? I mean, there needs to be some sort of punishment for these people. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that you can just randomly, subjectively call 911 just because you want to be involved. So no, I hear you, Juan. I think it's an unbelievable issue in many ways that people feel the need to intervene, quote unquote, in these situations.
Yeah, and
I'm gonna
and the
start
fact.
calling 911. Oh, go ahead. Go
No,
ahead.
no,
I
no.
was
Say
just
what you're
gonna.
gonna say. Say.
Eugene knows where I'm going.
No, say it.
I was gonna say something. I was gonna say next time I'm in the U.S., I'm gonna start calling 911 on like white people in suits.
I don't know. That might end.
I don't think they'll
I'll
come.
just be like,
That
there's.
might end the bad.
I think they won't. I think it's fine, but
They might
this
show
guy
up at
looks
your
a
house.
lot like. Yeah, that's actually probably what would happen. Jesus, I take it back. A terrible idea. It's gonna definitely backfire on me.
But Juan, you were saying.
No. It's just insane that like now that we're seeing these two cases that are really like off the back of a movement, right? Off of the back of the movement that we saw like the uprising that we saw last year, where so many millions of people were at, and still the justice system is the same.
Yeah.
Right? Still,
Mhm.
Kyle Rittenhouse, there's a good chance he might go off scot-free. Still, there's only one black juror in a case that is literally about the lynching of a black man.
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
the people are ready, just the way they're ready on climate. The people are ready for actual change, but our government is not. So, what are we gonna do?
It's a system
Yeah,
problem.
no, it's a good point.
Can I read
They
a
wonder
quick
why people
super
burn stuff
chat?
down.
Can I read?
Yeah, you can.
I'm going to read a quick super chat that is related to this. It's actually addressed to Eugene from That's a Wrap. Says Eugene brought up the millions being excluded from juries in Tuesday's Punch-Out episode. Applies to Arbery's case, and then keep up the great work, Solidarity.
Well, thank you
But
so
yeah.
much for that. I appreciate that. 20 million people excluded from juries because they have a former felony or, in some states, a misdemeanor conviction. Only one state in
wild.
America actually doesn't have any restrictions on people, even if you're actually in jail. That's Maine. You could be called for jury duty in jail, but you're automatically excused. I don't know what would happen if you wanted to serve. But nevertheless, 20 million people excluded from juries because they at one time allegedly did something. They were convicted of something. Doesn't necessarily mean they did it. Well, we're going to keep moving forward with the show here, maybe sticking with this theme of imprisonment and mass incarceration, and certainly sticking with the theme of politics, and that is the issue of political prisoners, specifically not a new effort, but a renewed effort to push for the freedom of Mutulu Shakur in the wake of what I would say are some relatively significant developments in terms of David Gilbert and Russell Maroon Shoat's political prisoners being released from prison. We are very happy to be joined for this conversation by Jonathan Stith, who is an organizer with the Malcolm X grassroots movement in D.C. and also the Free Mutulu Now campaign. Jonathan, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, it's so excited to be here.
Well, we're really excited to have you. And, this is a really interesting time for, those of us who have been addressing issues around political prisoners, for some time now. We've had both last year and this year some of the true stalwarts of liberation movements in this America who are behind bars released. And I guess maybe that's the first question I just want to ask you. And thinking about this renewed push, this Free Mutulu Now campaign, how are you feeling about the overall atmosphere around the issue of political prisoners?
It's a very interesting time. I think when we understand kind of where we are with the kind of presidential politics and Biden and his unrelenting support of police in the face of the largest mass mobilization that the universe has ever seen since Steven Universe, in the face of that, and kind of doubling down on policing. And yet we see the recent release of Russell Maroon Shoat's, David Gilbert, his sentence being commuted. And I think most importantly, the International Tribune on the Spirit of Mandela that happened in New York, I think 2 weeks ago, really in front of an international set of jurists. The U.S. was found guilty of 5 counts of genocide that included the imprisonment of political prisoners. And so I think this is a moment for us to really actually lean in, and for all of us who have been a part of the work of helping to free political prisoners to actually, we all need to be in an effort to renew our call to push forward with this news that, again, 70 years later, the United States is found guilty of genocide. And now there should be no question around the COINTELPRO's illegal activity and what it has cost and who has paid the cost. And as we say with Dr. Mutulu Shakur, 35 years is enough. And we call for free Dr. Mutulu Shakur and all political prisoners.
Mm-hmm. And, it's maybe in some ways a good segue talking about some of those who have just been released. Obviously, David Gilbert and, Sekou Odinga, who was previously released, sort of tied to the same set of events that Dr. Mutulu Shakur has been tied to. Tell us, who is Dr. Mutulu Shakur? I know some people have probably heard the name in relationship to Tupac and that world, but tell us more about him and his struggle prior to being imprisoned.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how I learned about Dr. Mutulu Shakur, all the shout outs on the Tupac songs. I was like, I got to figure out who this is. So absolutely, long live the spirit of Tupac Shakur. But Dr. Mutulu Shakur is a father, grandfather, healer, and human rights organizer who was part of the New African Independence Movement. Doc, he was politicized very early on in his life. His mother was blind, so he had to deal with the vicious state social justice system or social injustice system, trying to get support for his mom. At 15, was recruited into the Republic of New Africa by Herman Ferguson out of New York, who was a principal at the time, who was involved in the Ocean Hill-Brownsville fight around community control. And Mutulu was part of, or was at New Bethel in 1969 at the shootout. And part of his story is that he shielded both Herman Ferguson and his partner, Aya Ferguson, from the police bullets that spread. And so Mutulu has a long history of activism. He's most known for his work around acupuncture. And I think connected to the earlier story where y'all were talking about heroin in the United States, Mutulu and the work of the Black liberation movement, along with the Young Lords, along with the Republic of New Africa, were actually like a stalwart, were standing in the path of the government's plot to dope our communities out and then criminalize them for it. And I think that's part of such an important around the fight now. Like, they have evidence, right? This dude came out and said Nixon did it. Yeah, we did it. We said we were going to criminalize a whole set of communities using drugs, and they did it. And Doc and other political prisoners stood in the way of that. And Doc specifically because they have found an alternative way to deal with methadone in the community using acupuncture, which again, he discovers trying to find a solution to one of his children had been severely injured in a car accident. And they had been told by Western medicine that they would never walk again. And so Doc comes across acupuncture, and the acupuncture actually heals his daughters in ways that Western medicine couldn't. And so there's also a way that we have to understand the work that they were doing and why we can do reflexology and all of the wonderful shishi woo woo things that we do, right? Alternative medicine comes from a revolutionary struggle that was carried about by Dr. Mutulu Shakur and others. And he's been in prison 35 years. I think it's important to know he has stage 3 cancer, has suffered 2 strokes and glaucoma, and has glaucoma. So there's this way that, again, this is an elder who's dying in prison, and he served his time, right? He served his time. Who should be let free?
Yeah. I mean, it's an important issue on so many levels. He's served his time. He obviously is facing serious health challenges. And, and I know this is always a conversation. In a way, you could argue it really wouldn't matter to me if he, like, quote unquote, did what he said he was doing. I mean, these are political prisoners of war. They're not criminals. And I think that's political status is crucially important. It was something, obviously, the Irish Republican Army fought for years in the UK, political status that we need here in the United States. But I do think it is important to recognize that essentially they had no evidence at all. I mean, they grabbed him up, allegedly said he was providing material support. The whole to an action that took place, the Brinks robbery. The whole thing was a complete and total railroad, and that it really does represent also just the unbelievable racism of the criminal justice system, mass incarceration, and all of that, with the ease with which they were able to put him in prison on essentially nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Doc, he's charged under the RICO Act, right? And we've seen how that has been used to persecute Black communities. Anybody familiar with the hip hop community knows the RICO Act has been used to to really fuel mass incarceration, and Doc is charged under that. So you're absolutely right. There is no physical evidence to say he was there. But for me, I'm with you. I'm like, let's talk about what he's accused of. He's accused of liberating Assata Shakur. Who's mad at that?
Mhm.
Who thinks Doc should still be in jail for the liberation of Assata Shakur? Let's talk about it, right? Because we chanting, it's our duty to fight, it's our duty to win all day long. And she told us to free those who helped free her or are in jail for freeing her. The second one is they're accused of robbing banks. And where did the money go? It didn't go to their pockets, right? They went to supporting camps for Black kids in Mississippi. Who's mad at that? Who's really? Come on, talk to me, right? And then he's accused of sending money to African liberation movements abroad, particularly Zimbabwe.
It's a great
So
accusation.
again, right. So I'm like, yeah, this, and 35 years later, let's free this man. Free Dr. Mutulu Shakur. I don't understand what we understand around the world now, the evils of COINTELPRO, that we can, with any conscience, not fight for his release and a release of all political prisoners. They don't deserve to die in jail.
Well, talk about the campaign and talk about what you all are doing. I don't know if we've actually left the official week, but I know there's the Free Mutulu Week, and MXGM has been pushing and gathering forces all around the country to renew this push and push even harder.
Yeah, absolutely. So the campaign, though, the week of action is 35 cities, 35 actions to commemorate the 35 years that Doc has been held in federal prison. And we're asking groups and chapters in the MXGM have been doing events all week to educate, motivate, and organize our people to endorse and support the campaign to free Dr. Mutulu Shakur. There's also, Doc is not alone in terms of there are 4 other political prisoners who are also held by the federal government who have received multiple denials of parole. And we believe that clemency is their only way they're going to get free. And so we're calling for their freedom as well. That includes Leonard Peltier, Bill Nunn, and some other political prisoners I can't remember off the top of my head. So I'm sorry, but you can check out the demands on our website. And there's also 200 other prisoners that we assume are probably Black and brown folks who are under old federal law, who also have little chance of getting free, and we want to free them as well. They're all like, there's no chance of doing anything other than going home to be with their families. And then our third demand is to free them all, and that we really demand or calling for our people to actually really build a movement for the freedom of political prisoners. We have to understand this is part of the reparations that is due to us for the continuum. But if you want to just mark it at the 60s with what has been done with the war on drugs, it's easy to arrive at the conclusion that Dr. Mutulu Shakur should be a part of every reparations package. Every consequence and demand around ending the drug war should be the freedom of political prisoners, starting with Dr. Mutulu Shakur. So folks are taking action in DC. Folks are doing events on November 2nd. That's the day Assata Shakur was liberated. I think Philadelphia, they also did a screening of Dope is Death, and we invite folks to take action, right? And it's really small action. So you can watch the film Dope is Death, have a discussion around what you saw, endorse the campaign. We're asking people to also sign his clemency petition, to donate in multiples of 35, to write Dr. Mutulu Shakur again. He's had 2 strokes and suffering. His health is getting worse. I think this is also some of the urgency of our demand. So we're inviting folks to write Dr. Send him messages. These messages offer hope and healing, and give him strength, and also give us strength to let him know he's not forgotten and that there's a movement brewing to fight for his freedom.
Right on. Well, where can people look online or elsewhere to find out more about how they can get involved?
Absolutely. They can go to the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement website, free to land, mxgm.org/free Mutulu now.
Right on. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much. Really appreciate you giving us some time, helping us, sort through this and understand it, and helping people know how they can get engaged and take action to free Dr. Mutulu Shakur.
All right. Free to land.
Well, Rania, this is, listen, when I started talking about this, there's 100-some people. I think it was 120 people, political prisoners. Unfortunately, some folks have passed, some have gotten out, but a lot of people only get out when they are really sick. It's like compassionate release. That's what happened with Russell Maroon Shoatz. So absolutely, I think this is just critically important. And, I hope people really lean into this issue. I mean, Palestine, Ireland, South Africa. I mean, the political prisoners are a crucial part of this movement. I think everyone who's embracing socialism and revolution and radical ideas, well, these were the people who were shot, killed, imprisoned, essentially sentenced to death for these long sentences for advocating for the same things, and not just advocating, but for taking action to make them happen. And I think not only do we owe it to them, but raising up their fight and their struggle is part of the struggle today.
Absolutely. And, when we think about the prison industrial complex in the US that arose like after that era, right? Because it started to grow in the 70s, 80s, exploded in the 90s. There's been people who've suggested that part of that prison explosion also had to do with putting in prison a class and race of people that had the most revolutionary potential, who were the biggest part of the civil rights era, the Black Panther era, of
who are some of the people who've argued that,
70s.
Rania?
Eugene Puryear. But the point is it's important to even, I think, extend, like, obviously when we talk about political prisoners, to extend that conversation to the US locks up this massive amount of its population, and part of that apparatus is meant to suppress any sort of revolution. And on that note, I think I want to read this comment that somebody left, because I think it's important in a way, and this is not to be divisive or to say anything bad about the issue of Julian Assange. Is very important. That's a political prisoner. We should all be supporting his release. What the U.S. has has done to him is outrageous. It's reprehensible. However, this person said, well, white leftist outlets clickbait for Assange, thanks to BT News for covering Black and brown news. And to that, I just want to say, I think sometimes all of these other political prisoners do get left out. I'm not saying people who care about Assange are racist. I care about Assange. He's very important. WikiLeaks and what they did is very important. But we have to remember the others who are behind bars, who fought for similar ideals. Because like you said, these people are behind bars because they were fighting for socialism and taking bullets for it. They were fighting against war and against the military industrial complex and against racism and taking bullets for it. And so we have to remember those people. And I'm really glad that we have a platform that gives voice to those struggles.
No, absolutely. And I also really appreciate that comment. I mean, I think, it speaks to the nature of our society. And I mean, I agree with you 100%. We've obviously tried to cover the Assange trial and what's going on with him extensively. But, it's like for America, especially white America, press freedom is like a liberal issue. It jibes with their sort of red, white, and blue. You should have the right to free speech. You should have this. You should have that. And when you talk about other political prisoners in this country, from the BLA, from the Weather Underground, from the May 19th Communist Organization, from the Republic of New Africa, it's like, well, these people are criminals, and that, they shot somebody and they did this. But I think, as Jonathan laid out for us, the liberation of Assata Shakur, the liberation of money from some criminal bank in order to help young Black kids from urban areas get out into camps in rural areas and experience what it's like to be outside and enjoy life, for maybe the first time in their lives before people. The real Fresh Air Fund. You look at this, and again, the reason I raised the IRA is because, now generally the Irish movement is considered, whatever, legitimate, or the same thing could be said about the ANC, but they said the same thing. They said Nelson Mandela was a terrorist. They said, oh, well, you don't have solidarity with the Irish people rising up for their liberation because they're just killing people. But obviously, it's much deeper than that. These are liberation movements. It's the same thing here. So I would just call on everyone who's never heard of Mutulu Shakur or any of these other people to look into it, to fight for political prisoners, because they're the ones who continue to fight for you. And I can tell you, because I've worked on many issues, it's never difficult to get a solidarity statement from a political prisoner for progressive issues. They're always willing to call into meetings, to send letters. I mean, when we were organizing against the war in Iraq, the easiest statements to get were from folks like Dr. Mutulu Shakur, from Amia Abu Jamal. They were the first people to be on the front lines, even though they're behind bars. So, we'll leave it there for now on that issue, but I hope everyone does check out the Malcolm X grassroots movement's work to free Dr. Mutulu Shakur. And I think, Rania, that brings us to a close.
It does, but we'll be back next week, right?
We will. We will be back next week. As always, it is my pleasure to be here alongside you. And of course, the Freedom Side will be back. Don't forget, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news and become a patron. But we will see you next week.